last week I had to end sort of I didn't have to end abruptly, that's not quite the right term. I had to sort of rush through the last bit of what we were talking about, and I didn't really give anybody a chance to comment or respond, and so rather than immediately jumping forward to the next topic, I wanted to give us a little bit of a chance to talk a little bit more, if you wanted to, about some of the issues that I raised at the, or that we raised at the end of the class, talking about the issue. Okay, I think our microphone is on now. Talking about the issue of the problem, or the issue that comes up in creating a nation out of principles of rebellion, when we see in the scripture the idea that rebellion is not what Christians are supposed to do. And the point that I made at the time last week, and that I would make again this week, is that that doesn't mean that the nation that we're a part of is a bad nation, or that it hasn't done great things, or that God didn't have a plan for it. I've got the wrong set of notes here, I'm going to trade them out. But it does mean that there are consequences, because there are always consequences for sin. There are always effects that it has that are undesirable and damaging. And the point that I made last week as we finished up was that, in my opinion at least, one of the major results of creating our nation the way we did, and having it come out of these ideas of the authority of people to overthrow governments, and yet at the same time trying to create a nation that's one that's moral and Christian-based in many respects, the big problem that comes out of that is a sort of a kernel of lawlessness that's built into how we approach things. And I think, and as you look at our society today, and as you look at the transformation of our society over time, what you can see is that progressive or successive generations became increasingly rebellious and have become increasingly contemptuous of authority. And part of that is the fact that historically we see that happen in every society. But I think part of that is because of a reaction to creating a society where the underlying principle is, if you don't like authority, you can rebel against it. When you tell people that's your principle, it's pretty hard to go back then later and say, oh, no, not my authority, their authority, you know. And so that was the point that I was kind of wanting to leave us with last week. But like I said, I had to make it at the very end, and then we all had to head off to worship. So I wanted to come back to that and see if there was anybody that had anything they wanted to add or any additional thoughts on that. Okay, so, all right, Sylvia.
If you look now at the government that we have today, it's really not Christian. And then you go to the internet and YouTube, and everybody who is saying the truth gets thrown out, and I think it has to do with the government too. So I think we do have now a government that is absolutely not God-centered.
Well,
and is against God.
okay.
And don't we have to stand up because of that and say that's not right?
Okay, that's a slightly different topic than I was raising, but I don't mind addressing it. So that's the question, and if that's true, then how ought we to stand up and address that?
Make our voice heard and come out and say that is ungodly. Well, Obama said we're not a Christian nation anymore, but I disagree. And we have the right to disagree with that statement. So why can we not say that is ungodly? I do not have to accept that I have to be quiet what's going on with LGBTQ, whatever, that I have to go this way, that my children have to teach that way. That comes from the government, and I'm just against it. I'd say that is a big sin, and America will pay for it.
Okay. There's a few things to unpack there, but let me go back to the core question. how do you say make your voice heard?
Yeah.
What does that mean? How does that change things? What do we do to make our voice heard in your view?
We do not condone it, we stand against it, and we might pay for that, but then we're on God's side, not on Satan's side.
Okay, so from most pulpits that I see on the internet or see online, from most writings from churches that I read and come across, there is a consistent voice that says this is not what God wants. This is not the way that it should be. That voice seems to be largely ignored. So what I'm asking you is, you seem to feel like there's something more. What more is there? What else should we do?
Do we write to our legislator, to people who can bring that to a higher authority to voice it, how people feel?
Okay, so we could do that. In the case of my parents, they're actually close friends with their congressman in the House of Representatives, and he shares their opinion, and is, you know, kind of consistently a thorn in the side of trying to advance a variety of agendas at the national legislature. But so there, you can even go further than writing things. You can run for office. You can support candidates who do take the positions that you agree with or that you support. You can, you can help to fund groups that advocate. I mean, there's a lot of different ways we can do those things, but I think it's important to realize that in this country, none of those things will get you into trouble, except perhaps arguably with media or, but if you're a private citizen, not so much. It's if you're famous, it seems like they get really upset. But doing those things in this country, at least, is still permitted under the freedom of speech and freedom of religion clauses. And they're not really what I was talking about in terms of a rebellion, where you are actively attempting to overthrow the government. In this country, we actually have a system that allows us to remove people from office and vote other people in if we can agree on what the direction of our country should be, or if we can get enough people to agree with us on what the direction of our country should be. So rebellion is less necessary, perhaps arguably anyway. But to go back to the question I kind of asked at the beginning, what, is there any additional thoughts on the issues that I was raising with regard to rebellion leading to future rebellion and to a rebellious spirit? Or does that seem like something that's a little far-fetched?
Well, I'll wade into that.
Absolutely.
So, it's almost un-American to say that we're not going to rebel against tyranny and those that attack our governing process, constitution and our moral whatever status, our past, our history, all of that, and say, well, the greatest part about America is that we have elections often. It's interesting, though, that on the other side of that it's true that in Ephesians it says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Now, we're to put on the full armor of God and fight that, but it's not all just spiritual. Those actions are in people. We're fighting that struggle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against those that the devil is working through. Mm-hmm. Part of that can be within a government.
Okay. So in that situation then, does that give us the authority or the obligation even to rebel against that sort of a government? And I think that here again, we're talking about two different things. We've got to make a distinction. As a nation, you have the ability, and there's nothing in the scriptures that would suggest that one nation cannot choose to take on another nation for the evil that they're doing. That was actually the mandate that was given to the Israelites. It's a little dangerous to say that's our mandate because that was God telling them directly, but still, if it's a nation against a nation, you're not rebelling against your nation. Your nation is choosing to fight against someone who's doing evil. If it's you within your nation rebelling against the government of your nation, that is a different situation. I think we can all see the difference, so that doesn't mean it's necessarily inherently wrong, it's just that's a different situation. So in that kind of a situation, would you say that at least possibly that what you're reading there in Ephesians would give us an opportunity or a mandate even to rebel, to fight back, where we see the direction of our government or the overall actions of our government being evil, even if they're not directly forcing us to do evil?
So it's a twisty situation. It's an interesting question. I think that anytime that we take our disagreement about certain issues that the government is either promoting, allowing, or legalizing, when we say that's not right, it's ungodly, it's a trend I don't think is healthy, all of those things, it's a whole other thing to then take that to a jihad against all of those things. I think that we need to fight those things with our voices, with our conduct, etc. Like, in other words, is it okay to bomb an abortion clinic, you know? And I would say, no, it's not right to do that, but we should be able to resist it. We shouldn't say that if we resist it, that means, in this case, that we're not in subjection.
Right.
Okay?
And I think that's one place, where our government is so radically different from the ones that Paul is dealing with, because there are a lot of ways we can resist our government that do not fall into rebellion. In the context of our nation, in the context of our laws, because we have, for example, even the right to protest, which would, in some countries today, and certainly in Paul's time, would have been seen as rebellion, as insurrection. The right to protest, to gather together and to, peacefully do things that might even disrupt the flow of government, that might even disrupt the flow of traffic, things like that. Those things are under the Constitution, those are protected rights, where at worst you may face a fine for impeding something, Now there's a difference between that and breaking into places or assaulting people or something like that, and that's when you move from protest to riot. But nevertheless, we have a lot of ability to resist, to fight back, to use whether it's the legal system or the voting system, or just inertia to try to move things or to get things where we want them to be. And part of, I think, why we're here right now is because in many ways we have not done that very effectively as Christians. Or alternatively, the consensus has not been there for some time to do some of those things among Christians. But however you want to look at it, there's been a failing to continue to advance those causes and to resist that which we think is evil. And so in this country, at least, we have a greater opportunity. And I guess the argument that I was making with respect to the founding of this country is that when you look at what the King of England or the government of England was doing with its colonists, it is difficult to view those things. When you go through the list of them that we looked at earlier, it's difficult to view those things as rising to the level of a moral imperative, because in fact, not one of the things that they argued as a basis for overthrowing the government was a moral issue at all, was an issue of taking away their rights to worship, or forcing them to worship someone they didn't want to, or forcing them to pay for something that they believed was immoral. Basically, their arguments almost entirely distilled to, you won't let us govern ourselves, and you keep interfering with our ability to tax and live our lives the way we want to. And I guess what I would argue is that is not good enough. That is not a legitimate reason why a Christian should rebel against the government. Now, protest, sure, you want to protest, you want to vote, you want to write your congressman, you want to try to start a movement to make things the way you want them to be. Absolutely, because that's what we can do in this country. No matter what you're looking for, you can do those things. But if we're going to actually not protest, if we're going to actually rebel, we're going to refuse to do something the government tells us to do, we're going to do something the government says we can't do, those things need to be things that God says we're supposed to be doing or we're not supposed to be doing. They need to be in response to a moral imperative like that. And the point that I was making with regard to our nation and its founding is not that the people who founded it didn't have good ideas and that it wasn't ultimately a good outcome and that God didn't use it, but that when you begin a nation with the principle that when you don't like the way the government looks, you don't like the way the government operates in your life, you can overthrow it. Even if you dress it up. And see, that's the thing, it was dressed up really fancy. It talks about their creator at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. There's multiple references to God and those kinds of things in the writings of the Founding Fathers around the Declaration of Independence and the creation of the Constitution. But, so it was dressed up in moral terms, and certainly the people who set up the government after that were looking for moral foundations and to lay it on moral principles and Christian principles in many cases. But when the underlying truth is you did it because you didn't like the way the government was treating you, you didn't like the fact that you didn't get to do everything you wanted to do, at some point there's a kernel there of this isn't quite the way it's supposed to be. And when people start to see that, when people, even if they don't think about it in the terms that I'm expressing to you now, and I think very few have, but even if they don't think about it in those terms, that underlying principle, that kernel of you know, wrongness that's in there, it's going to spread. Those things they just don't stay hidden forever. Unless you go back and remove it somehow, things that are wrong gradually infect the whole. And I think that's kind of part of what's happened with our views of authority and the way that we treat authority is that over time, that idea that we can, you know, that we can overthrow governments, that government is subject to the will of the people, and that the will of the people is really basically, you know, we want to move the government in whatever direction we want to. Well, what's happened is the government has flexed to the point now where people can almost do anything, most of anything they want to. And they didn't have to overthrow the government, they just had to kind of shove it around until it reshaped itself to what they wanted. And they did that in part because they knew that that was how, or they were told that that was how government should look. And that is not the principle about government and authority that we see in the scriptures. The principle of authority that we see in the scriptures is that government is instituted by God, but more fundamentally, the government should be upholding the will of God. Good governments are supposed to be doing that. And as our government increasingly stop doing that, we get more and more comfortable with that principle and more willing to just push it around some more. And I don't mean like literally like rebelling, push it around, I mean just reshaping it, you know, to what we want it to be. And so we legalize drugs and we, you know, legalize all sorts of conduct and, you know, and then we move on to teaching the normalcy of those kinds of conduct and to mandating that people, you know, can't, in certain positions have to do things, well, that their positions require in order to carry out some of those things. And all of these things snowball, and they become worse as we go along. And many of us look around and we think, you know, I've only lived 50 years. And from the time I was old enough to really pay attention to what the government's doing to where I am now, it's an unbelievable change in what I would call about 35 years. It's unbelievable that we went from there to here. And some of you who've lived longer than me have been paying attention for 50 years or 60 years, are probably even more flabbergasted at where we are now. In such a short period of time, when you look at the length of this nation, and even more than that, the length of human history, it just seems like some of this has happened so very quickly. You know, but here we are. Mark?
I was going to say, too, we've got to look at believers and non-believers. We are outnumbered, period.
Right.
Period. We are. And so now, as the outnumbered, the people that have that are getting into the authority positions in our government are non-believers, or
right.
At least they don't live their lives like they should. So when you think about that, that's exactly what we should expect, because they're taking this country to where what they think it should be,
Right.
without God. Because that's an authority that they don't want to have. Where we want that authority and keep it with God, and then keep it under His commandments and what He wants us to
Right.
do. But when for a long time they talked about, we're at that precipice of 50%, 50 and 50. Well, we're past that
Yeah.
now. We've gone past that. And so, as far as evil and good, now what do? We live our lives the best we can and try to do what God wants us to do. But that majority now is going to say, hey, you're the bad people now.
Yeah.
We're the good guys, you're the bad people, even though we have God on our side.
Right.
So the world has changed so
Right.
much, like you said, so quickly, but it's because of non-believers.
Right.
There was a lot more believers, at least to me, when I was growing up. Now,
Oh, yeah.
we've shifted, and
Yeah.
you go away from God, this is what happens.
Yeah.
Exactly what happens.
Especially through.
You can't expect anything else. So when you talk about authority, and you want to do these things, you want to say, okay, I can fix this. Mark can fix this if you let me do it. But guess what? There's a majority now that don't want to be fixed.
Right.
And the only thing we can do is preach Jesus to them
Right.
and try to say, hey, look, you're going in the wrong direction. And that's the reason why He said this is going to be a narrow path. There's going to be a lot of people that are lost in most of this world. So we've got to say, hey, you're on the wrong side of this. Sooner or later, like Revelation said, God's going to win. You happen to be you're on the losing side. That's the only thing we can tell people. But to actually overthrow what the people want right now, it's hard to say, hey, that's a Christian thing to do.
Yeah.
But then, like Sylvia said, we got to stand up when we have that opportunity. Hey, look, homosexuality is wrong, period. That's what God says. It's right there. But you are saying now it's normal. It's okay.
Right.
Our authorities, So we have that opportunity. We got to stand up and say, God's on my side. And so when we can, even if we should be then expect the attacks, because that's what God says is going to happen to you. You're going to be on my side. You're going to get this. So I think that's part of it. I know I'm preaching here.
No, you're right. You're right.
But I'm saying we should expect this.
Yeah.
And it's going to get worse for us as
Yeah.
Christians. That's the only thing it is.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because I didn't want to be the one to start to say that, but the truth is, and the truth is unpleasant, but the dynamics and the numbers are very clear. As Mark said, for a long time, America was 40%, this is political, so forgive me for a minute, because this is not strictly speaking the moral side of things, but America was basically about 40% Democrat, about 40% Republican, and about 20% independent. And those independents basically controlled what happened in most elections, and more often than not, they split relatively evenly. And so you would see elections that were decided by 51 or 52% voting for one person, and slightly less than half voting for the other person. Or maybe in some cases, even an election where the person who won got 48% of the vote, and the person who lost got 47% of the vote, and some other people got the rest of it. Those numbers are no longer the same. And morally speaking, there was kind of an element of that, although I think to some extent Christians were fooling themselves that those numbers were the same thing as moral numbers, because for a long time now, if you look at the two political parties, both of them have had a significant element of deviating away from morality. Now one maybe pays a little more lip service to one side of morality, and another to another part of it, but neither one of them really are focused on a moral compass of some sort. So in some respects, I think it was kind of a little bit of a smokescreen anyway, but at this point, those numbers are no longer true. The demographics have changed to the point now where, especially because of the younger generations, as they are eligible to vote at least, they are overwhelmingly Democrat, and they are significantly more morally flexible, let's say, than previous generations were. And so at this point, if you actually had your eligible voters actually vote, you would probably be looking at a 60-40 or worse split when it comes certainly to moral issues. And and more generally political issues. And to a certain extent, the only reason that has not become that obvious yet is because younger voters don't vote in large numbers yet, or have not traditionally. They are starting to vote more, and as they get older, they're starting to care more, and they're starting to vote more. And so the consequence of that has been, on a political side, that the Republican Party in many places has been using a number of tactics, gerrymandering and other things, to try to minimize the degree to which the demographics are shifted. And the founders built into the Constitution the Electoral College in part to prevent large population centers and states with large populations from being able to overwhelm the electorate. But all of these things only work up to a point. You get a high enough demographic shift and it doesn't matter what you do, you can't stop it. And so what we're seeing increasingly among some people is this sense that this means that somehow our electoral system is broken, that something shady must be going on to cause these things to happen. Well, it's not. There's nothing shady going on. This is what happens in democracy when the demographics shift away from what you want them to be. And one of the most difficult lessons that we're going to have to get our heads around as Christians and as conservatives, and for the most part anyway, is that for a long time, America looked the way we wanted it to look. And democracy worked just fine for us because it did what we wanted it to do. And it stood up where we wanted it to stand up, and it said what we wanted it to say. And for the people on the other side of that, it really kind of stunk because democracy didn't look the way they wanted it to. And the majority got to say things and make them do things that they didn't want to do, and follow rules that they didn't want to follow. And now, as that has shifted, we find ourselves, at that point, they were saying, why don't we be reasonable? Why can't we talk about this and find some common ground? And now that things are shifted, suddenly we find ourselves saying, why can't we be reasonable? And why can't we find some common ground? And if you expect them to be any nicer to us than we were to them, you're fooling yourself. That's the reality. And that's the world we live in. And the problem is that democracy is designed to do that. It's built into it. It is one of the weaknesses and strengths of the system. It can adapt with time. That is a strength. But the weakness is that it can be led into some very dangerous places. And that's what our founders recognized even when they created the system. And that's certainly what some of the writers who wrote about our democracy as it was being created said. And so we find ourselves now saying, okay, democracy doesn't work for us anymore. Yeah, it does what the people want it to do, but the people are not doing what I want them to do. Well, okay, that's unfortunate, and I don't like it, and I want to try to change people's minds. But if I'm going to be fair about what democracy is, I have to say the system is still working sort of the way it's supposed to. You know, there's some other problems systemically that I'm not even going to get into right now because this is going to turn into a political rant, and that's not the point. But the point is that from a moral standpoint, the world has the country has shifted under us. And it is not simply that our leaders are going and doing things that the people don't want them to do. They're going and doing things that some of the people don't want them to do. But they wouldn't keep getting reelected if they were doing things that all of the people didn't want them to do, or even that most of the people didn't want them to do. For the most part, they're doing exactly what their constituents want. And we don't like that because that's not what we want. But it is self-deluded to think that the government is not doing what anybody wants just because it doesn't do what I want. And so we have to be mindful of that as we think about the big picture going forward. How are we going to make choices? What are we going to be able to do? And recognize that while we still have the right to speak and we still have the right to protest and we still have the right to do a lot of these things, that the audience for that is dwindling. And that makes it harder and harder for us to really impact things the way that we've been used to. I've got Jerry for a while, and then I have Steve, so go ahead, Jerry.
Just a thought that I've had on Mark's comments, and there is how many in that majority are taking the position that they still believe in God and interpreting God in their fashion rather than what God says.
Oh, there's a lot.
There's, I mean, that to me, it becomes a real problem when they say, well, you just don't understand the way the Scripture really is written. I mean, that they try to justify their own actions by their understanding of what God says.
Right.
And
there are, if I remember the last polls, it was fairly recent, there's still a majority of Americans who claim to be Christian. But what that means to them is much, much more flexible. And more importantly, that as the majority has dwindled, as the number has dwindled, you've always had lots of Christians who didn't necessarily believe in a more conservative view of Christianity and believed in kind of just live and let live kind of Christianity anyway, or a much more open-ended interpretation of the scriptures. But as the numbers dwindle, that starts to take you below the majority line, and even starts to become a larger percentage of what's there that are calling themselves Christians. And so, yeah, when you actually look at those who would say, okay, I believe in God and I think our government should reflect biblical principles, I would guess that your number is way below the majority at that point because of adding that additional element to it. Steve?
I think some of the problems are that Christians, people like us, view the government as something that should be aligned with God's Word. And as we see that decline over time in culture, and it's not just the last 30 years, you can go, you've heard of the Roaring '20s, and you've heard of the Civil War,
Right.
You've heard of the Indians wars and all the things. So assassination of presidents, and you look back and there's always been cultural difficulties within our nation and that didn't align with God's Word. So what we want is the government to align with God's Word more, and we see it going away from it more, and it's very frustrating for us. But if you look at any sort of speeches that atheists give, they're perfectly happy with the trend of culture right now because they don't have those same sentiments. They think it's great that people can love each other and marry whoever they want, whatever they want. They think it's great that we're moving toward a more socialistic dynamic because they think that's good for all. They don't ever resort back to a creator or a designer, and we say things like, well, God is in control, God is in control. And if he's in control, why are things happening? And we get very frustrated. Well, God is in control, but he doesn't control everything, okay? And it's obvious. You just look at all the kingdoms that have ever existed. He obviously is not trying to finesse those into a perfect situation. Now, one thing that he is absolutely in control of is what Jesus said to Peter after Peter said, "You're the Christ." He said, well, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And that's what we need to derive comfort in, that is an unchanging victory that we participate in, even though our culture is dissolving in front of our own eyes.
Yeah, and it's important to realize that historically the church has grown the fastest in governments, under governments, and in situations that were not godly, that were not pro-Christian. It has grown the fastest when it was persecuted. It has grown the fastest when it was in places like communist Russia, where the government was trying its very best to stamp it out. It grows because it grows in people. And if we start trying to think that we have to fix the government so that Christianity can be fixed or can grow, we've misunderstood how Christianity works, because Christianity is not about governments. That's the brilliance of Christianity. Judaism was always linked. You had to have a government in control because otherwise you couldn't do all the stuff you had to do to be a good Jew. We don't have to do any of that stuff. We need a room for a few people to meet, some grape juice and some bread, and we're good to go. Maybe a Bible. All these days, if you got your phone, you can have a Bible. So Christianity is designed to be able to operate anywhere under any circumstances. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to get the government, when we have the opportunity to do good things and to be aligned with God's will as much as possible. But when we spend all of our time focused on that and upset about that and feeling like when it was better like that was when Christianity was better, that's not true. Just because the government was more aligned with God's mindset and teachings and approach doesn't mean Christianity was doing any better. It just means we felt a lot better about how Christianity was doing. Those are two very different things. And it's kind of one of those things where I fear that sometimes the belief that America was a Christian nation became an excuse for us to not have to do very much, because after all, the nation's all good and taken care of. It's a Christian nation, right? Now that the nation clearly isn't operating as a Christian nation, we're starting to feel a little pressure. Maybe we have to step up now, And that can be a very discomforting feeling, but on some level, at least it should also be a very motivating feeling for us as Christians. So, the simple reality is that when it comes to a godless government, Christians have never been called to rebel against it except where they had to do what God wanted them to do. The rest of the time, they've been called to simply spread His word, and sometimes that's been the rebellion, but to simply spread His word and to grow the church, because the church is the government, the kingdom that supersedes and it will exist long after all these governments are gone, and exists in the hearts and the minds of all the people who believe in Jesus. And so when we think in those terms, we start to realize just how temporary it is, whether our government is good or bad, or doing good things or bad things. And again, there's still an incentive to try to get it to do the right thing, and in a government where we have some input, we should keep doing that. But we don't want to get hung up on it. And we don't want to make that our mission as opposed to spreading the gospel. Because if you convert 100 people, you're still going to have gotten further along than if you convince one congressman he should vote against some bill that you think is wrong. So our focus needs to be on spreading the gospel and on the kingdom, and not on the government and what we don't like or disagree with what it's doing. So, all right, I got to finish this up, but I want to actually leave you with something a little bit less serious than this, but it actually ties into, ironically, to the rebellion against Great Britain. I don't know how many of you earlier this week, this thing came out where a professor of chemistry came out from America, came out and said that the best way to make tea is to add a little bit of salt and a little bit of lemon to your tea. And her reasoning was because that would it would offset some of the bitterness of the tea, and it would make it a more a smoother flavor. And you add the lemon because it makes the color a little nicer. And it was about as tone deaf as you could possibly be when it comes to why people make tea. But whatever. So the British immediately online especially just went nuts. And I mean, there was just all sorts of posts about this and how ridiculous it was. And eventually our embassy in London actually felt the need to weigh in on this. And our embassy wrote this letter. I apologize, I put this way further along here than I realized. Our embassy wrote this this thing, and here's what it said. I'm sorry, this isn't in large action. You guys probably see it better than I can. Today's media reports of an American professor's recipe for the perfect cup of tea has landed our special bond with the United Kingdom in hot water. Tea is the elixir of camaraderie, a sacred bond that unites our nations. We cannot stand idly by as such an outrageous proposal threatens the very foundation of our special relationship. Therefore, we want to assure the good people of the UK that the unthinkable notion of adding salt to Britain's national drink is not official United States policy and never will be. Let us unite in our steeped solidarity and show the world that when it comes to tea, we stand as one. And then the final line, which is the best line, the U.S. Embassy will continue to make tea in the proper way, by microwaving it. And if you don't understand why that's funny, you don't drink tea. So anyway, I just thought this was sort of brilliant. Like I said, it's completely off topic, but it's a lot of fun. So, all right, thank you guys for your participation. Next week, we will begin talking about murder. And believe it or not, God is against that.